My guest today is former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. She is the author of a fantastic new book called Fascism, A Warning, that feels even more real every morning I wake up and see a tweet from Donald Trump. So thank you for being here. We kept the peace after World War II because of the creation of institutions like the United Nations, more intertwined banking and trade systems, important alliances like NATO. But time and time again, you see politicians convince publics that the answer to their problems is turning inward and ignoring those institutions. And those institutions are dismissed as globalism or anti-American. Why is it so much easier to demagogue these institutions that have served us well over time?
I think there are a number of factors that have to do with this. First of all, I think that they're not perfect institutions. They were created in answer to the horrors that had happened during World War II, which really had been brought on by hatred, hyper-nationalism, finding a scapegoat, leaders that were willing to say that they could solve everything. And they were a real experiment, I think, in terms of trying to do what we call multilateralism and trying to figure out how to solve problems that required more than one country's input to make them go away. So that's one thing. The second thing is that these institutions, in many ways, are faceless. And people do want an identity, and we want to know, who we really are, and whether it's ethnic or linguistic or religious, and that's fine. I think that's perfectly normal to want to know more about your background. But if my identity hates your identity, then it leads to nationalism and hyper-nationalism. Patriotism is one thing, but nationalism is very dangerous because what it, again, creates an us versus them. Mm-hmm. And me, as I went through this book and I looked at what were the historic aspects to it, some of it has to do with this major division, us versus them, and then a leader who identifies with us versus the them and doesn't care about the rights of the them, only about the power of the us.
Secretary Albright, you have a chapter in the book that's about the President of the United States, and I feel like there's sort of two parts to it. One is the level of concern you may or may not have about his authoritarian instincts, but the other is about the damage he's doing and the cover he's giving to authoritarian regimes around the world when he attacks institutions like the press, the judiciary, et cetera. Can you talk about both of those elements and how concerned you are about the current President of the United States?
Let me begin with the international part, which is something that kind of tags onto what we were talking about in post-Cold War, in the post-Cold War world. I think one of the things that has been kind of a guide for me in my life, and it goes back to what you asked me initially. I am somebody who believes that when the U.S. is absent, terrible things happen. And for somebody that was born in Czechoslovakia, Munich was really a watershed event. And it was an agreement that was made among the British and French and the Germans and Italians over the heads of Czechoslovakia, and the country I was born in was sold down the river. America was not present. And then what happened when we lived in England and I was a little girl and the Yankees came, everything changed. And you thought, okay, it's going to be all right. I felt that even as a little girl. And then what happens after the war, when as a result of agreements reached during World War II, Europe was divided in half, and the country I was born in was behind the Iron Curtain. So I could go on, but mostly my way of looking at things comes from whether the U.S. is present or not. Mm-hmm. And so I was very proud to first work for President Carter and then for President Clinton when America stood for human rights, for calling countries out for not treating their populations properly, for doing things that undermined the democratic systems. And America was in a leading role, not telling everybody what to do, but being an example and being engaged. And so what is bothering me now is that not only are we not involved internationally in a way that I would support, but also that we give sustenance and cover to authoritarian leaders who, in fact, are really working on this us versus them aspect and developing concepts that are anti-democratic. And then the other part goes, not only are we not leading, but we also are providing an internal very bad example, which, again, is what I was writing about. Mm-hmm. I went back and I looked at the history of the rise of fascism in a number of countries and discovered that there are fascism is hard to define, but there are certain common things that happen. One is a denigration of the role of the press, and believing it and not understanding the importance of the press. The other is a leader who has no respect for the rule of law and also undercuts the whole role of the judiciary. Then there is this aspect of calling on nationalism to motivate people and to, in fact, really make even more serious the divisions that exist in society. There also are the kind of tools that are used of having rallies with banners and uniforms and using propaganda, mm-hmm. And basically not having any respect for the views of others. And so those are kind of the way I saw it. And it was very interesting because Mussolini, and there's a great quote which I think summarizes an awful lot of things, as he was consolidating his power, he said, if you pluck a chicken one feather at a time, nobody notices.
Right.
And so I have been concerned about the feather plucking that is going on in the United States, so that our leader is now exhibiting some of the tendencies that I spoke about. I think he is the least democratic president that I've observed. And then put that together with our lack of leadership internationally, that's what I'm concerned about.
Yeah, a lot of plucking going on, seemingly daily. Madam Secretary, I was hoping to ask you a question or two about Syria, because Trump's team is right now, as we speak, figuring out what to do after Assad again used chemical weapons against his own people. There's actually a good chance that between the time we record and release this interview that he will have launched a strike. If you were sitting in the Situation Room today advising President Trump and the team, what would you recommend that he do to respond to Assad in this instance?
Well, I think it's not just a matter of the immediate response. I do think that what happened in terms of a leader of a country poisoning his own people with chemical weapons, he's a war criminal.
Yeah.
And the fact that he had done it before and the fact that he had made agreements not to do it anymore and to get rid of his chemical weapons poses a very serious threat. And I do think there needs to be some well-thought-out response that makes a lot of sense proportionally. But the main thing that bothers me is that it is unclear to me as an interested citizen. I have no idea what the plan is. You can't just kind of do one-off things. You need to have some kind of a strategic plan and figure out what your objectives are, what strategy you're going to use. And that's what I don't know the answer, because from everything that I can tell, there is no overall strategy. And what happens is you can't do serious policy with tweets. What I find interesting, I was just reading that that Moscow has responded all of a sudden to President Trump's most recent tweet about the fact that very smart and new missiles are coming, saying that they don't do diplomacy by tweets. But I do think that there need to be diplomatic contact. There needs to be a plan. We need to figure out what friends and allies we have in this and understand that you can't go back and forth and one day say, I'm pulling out the forces, and then all of a sudden tweeting that the missiles are coming. Right. So that unpredictability in it is very dangerous.